It was day 118 of a war that had already reshaped the map of Eastern Europe, and the ground was burning on multiple fronts at once. June 21st brought no rest, no pause, no diplomatic silence. What it brought instead was a clear and brutal picture of a conflict grinding deeper into the bones of an entire nation. Russia answered the recent Ukrainian action at Snake Island not with restraint, but with fire. Missiles and artillery rained down on Odessa, Mykolaiv and Kharkiv in what looked less like a military response and more like punishment. An emotional reaction dressed up as a strategic one, and Kyiv's message to its own people was unusually direct. Do not ignore air raid sirens, not for the next few days, at least through the 26th of June. The tone carried something beneath the surface, a quiet confidence. Ukraine, officials made clear, had tools at its disposal to make the cost of escalation extremely steep for the other side. If the pressure increases, the response will match it. Up in Kharkiv, the situation was what military analysts sometimes call positional fuss, meaning lots of movement, lots of noise, but no dramatic breakthrough in either direction. The problem was the shelling itself. Artillery rounds were landing inside a major city. 15 people had lost their lives. 16 more were wounded. And analysts, watching the pattern closely, believed this wasn't random. Russia appeared to be shelling indiscriminately with a specific purpose in mind, attempting to force Ukraine into a reaction, ideally one that would pull artillery and reinforcements away from other critical sectors. There was also concern about the forces gathered near Belgorod. If those units applied serious pressure, Ukraine could be compelled to divert even more resources northward, slowly draining strength from other areas that desperately needed it. The strategy wasn't subtlety, it was exhaustion. Grind the opponent down, stretch the lines, drain the reserves. And Kharkiv, once a city that seemed safely distant from the worst of the fighting, had now become a front-line city in every practical sense of the word. It may remain that way for a long time. Residents were urged again, if you are vulnerable, if you have elderly relatives, children, people who cannot shelter effectively, please leave. Further south and east, in the corridor between Izium and Lyman, multiple smaller engagements were taking place simultaneously. No massive single battle, but a constant back and forth of localized clashes. Intelligence indicated that Russia had likely shifted 2 or more tactical battalion groups towards Sievierodonetsk, which told its own story about where Russian command believed the next opportunity lay. And in Sievierodonetsk itself, that story was becoming clearer by the hour. Russian forces had taken the settlement of Mykolaiv and were now pushing toward Bilahora, Borivske, and Sirotine. Localized battles were ongoing, and the risk level was real. This wasn't a front that had stabilized, it was one that was moving, and moving in a direction that demanded attention. But perhaps the most alarming tactical picture that day was unfolding near Hirske-Zolote. The word used was serious problems, and that description earned its weight. Russia had committed more than 3 battalion tactical groups to this section of the front, a significant concentration of force. They had seized the town of Toshkivka and were pressing toward Mirna Dolina. The goal appeared to be encirclement, cutting off the Hirske-Zolote pocket and trapping the Ukrainian units inside. What made this particularly concerning wasn't just the numbers, it was the method. Russian command appeared to be learning. Gone, at least in this sector, were the clumsy frontal assaults that characterized earlier phases of the war. Instead, they were attacking across a wide front simultaneously, using local terrain advantages, identifying weak points, and creating small isolated pockets rather than attempting single dramatic breakthroughs. Adaptation in a military force mid-conflict is a dangerous thing to witness from the other side. Near Popasna, Russian units had reached the Bakhmut-Lysychansk road, close to the village of Berestove, which represented a meaningful advance, though they were subsequently pushed back. Pressure continued on Klinove, with the apparent objective of forcing Ukrainian defenders back behind the road entirely. Stepping back from the individual engagements and looking at the larger picture, the assessment was measured but honest. Russia had achieved tactical success in several of these areas. The conditions existed for that to develop into something more significant, what military strategists would call operational success, if an encirclement could actually be completed. But that hadn't happened yet. The risk was present. The outcome was not determined. What would a sound Ukrainian response look like? Analysts suggested that a strategic withdrawal to a new defensive line, conducted during a rotation of units, could be the smartest play. Bring in fresh troops to hold the defense. Move the exhausted current units to the rear for recovery and resupply. The current configuration, with its long exposed flanks, would actually be an asset if Ukraine had large reserve forces available. Those flanks could become the teeth of a trap, the kind of encirclement reversal that German commanders executed during the Second World War with devastating effect. But that kind of maneuver requires reserves you can commit. Whether those reserves exist in the necessary numbers is a question only Ukrainian military command can answer. And importantly, that command has been given substantial authority by the president to make exactly these kinds of decisions. The people closest to the information are the ones making the calls. Down in Zaporozhye, no significant changes. The front there held its shape. In Kherson, Ukrainian forces retained control of Kiselivka, roughly 15 kilometers from the city of Kherson itself. On a map, 15 kilometers looks like a short drive. In the context of contested territory, under fire, with logistics chains under pressure and armored resistance dug in, 15 kilometers can represent half a year of fighting. Distance on a map and distance on a battlefield are two entirely different measurements. On the subject of military support arriving from allied nations, there were two notable developments. Slovakia had put forward a concrete plan to supply 12 MiG-29 fighter aircraft to Ukraine, contingent on Czechia and Poland taking over the air patrol responsibilities that Slovakia currently carries. That arrangement appeared to be in motion. Separately, the German self-propelled howitzers, the PZH-2000 units that had been discussed and anticipated for some time, had physically arrived in Ukraine. Hardware on the ground, not just a promise on paper. The subject of accountability for wartime conduct came up as well. The United States Attorney General traveled to Ukraine and delivered a message of substantial support for the effort to prosecute individuals responsible for documented war crimes. The visit carried symbolic weight, but it also carried practical implications for the legal proceedings being assembled. The situation involving children remained one of the most painful chapters in an already devastating conflict. Roughly 190,000 children had been moved from Ukraine into Russia. Of those, tens of thousands were believed to have been taken by force. There were reports of organized camps established with the explicit purpose of teaching Russian language and culture to these children, a detail that carried enormous legal and moral weight under international frameworks governing armed conflict. As of that day, 311 children were confirmed dead.
The United Kingdom announced it was developing a specific sanctions framework targeting individuals responsible for particularly brutal conduct toward children. Lithuania announced that it would extend its enforcement of transit restrictions to road transport for sanctioned goods, adding to the rail restrictions already in place. Russia's response, predictably, consisted of threats. Turkey announced plans for negotiations the following week, a detail that stood out for one specific reason.
Ukraine had not been consulted before the announcement was made. That's a meaningful omission in a situation where one of the parties involved is the country whose territory is being contested. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán received an invitation to visit Kyiv. The framing around this was pointed. The European Union had reached a collective position, and any member state choosing to deviate from that position on matters of this significance would be creating a serious internal challenge for the bloc. If Hungary were to block Ukraine's EU candidate status, it would trigger a genuine institutional crisis. Options available to the EU in such a scenario included revisiting Hungary's veto rights, a step that would ultimately serve Hungary's interests poorly. The invitation to Kyiv was also, in a sense, a test. On the subject of Ukrainian military operations in occupied territory, strikes were being conducted on concentrations of military equipment and supplies, including positions within Donetsk city. The distinction that officials drew sharply was between military targets and civilian ones. Ukraine does not target civilians. That claim was backed with a specific illustration. In 10 personally observed instances, Ukrainian forces had chosen to pass on high-value military targets because the risk of civilian casualties was too great. 10 times, a valuable strike was declined. That's a choice that carries a cost, and it was made anyway. The gas extraction platforms in the Black Sea became a point of bitter irony. Those platforms were financed by Ukraine, constructed in Ukrainian territorial waters, and legally owned by Ukraine. They were seized by force. And now Russia was framing its position as one of legal grievance, accusing Ukraine of violating international law. The platforms were taken. The framing was being inverted. Regarding prisoner exchanges, decisions at this level were being made at the highest points of command. There was specific information suggesting that the Russian president himself was personally involved in approving each individual exchange. One case stood out in particular. A medic known by the call sign Tyra had been exchanged. The reason this case had particular urgency was that Russian authorities had been attempting to use her as the centerpiece of a show trial, a constructed legal example. Ukraine moved to bring her home. Who was given in return was not disclosed publicly, but the language used suggested the exchange involved someone of considerable significance to the other side. And one final note, the kind of closing thought that tends to stay with you. The most important insider information, the details that can't be spoken yet, the full picture of what actually happened and how decisions were made, that would be shared 1 month after the war ends, which meant someone, somewhere, was already thinking about that day, already planning for what comes after. And that, in its own quiet way, was a statement of its own.